Okay, well, welcome everyone to the first Inuit Noon program of the season, Fall 2015. We're very excited about the programs we have planned this semester. I'm Samantha Boland, for those of you that don't know me. I work in the Office of Alumni Relations at Northeastern. I'm a program assistant on the Signature Programs team, and we oversee the Inuit Noon program. So thank you all for joining us today. We're very excited, and I'm going to hand it over to Joe Hunt, who's going to introduce our speaker and program.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to welcome everyone here who's not only present but also streaming with us. I think all of us today who have been at least casually acquainted with media today is well aware of the fact that there have been significant numbers of attacks on civilians over the past several decades. And these attacks have had various objectives, and their success in achieving their goals using this strategy of violence is dependent on many complex and interrelated factors. As a result, the focus of today's presentation is this. Over the years, how successful has this much-used strategy of inflicting violence on civilians been? Our presenter this afternoon, Dr. Max Abrahms, has researched this question for several years. And his analysis shows that such civilian targeting is rarely successful. In today's discussion, Dr. Abrahms will provide insight into his research, as well as giving us a review of the most current events. Dr. Abrahms has received his bachelor's degree from Penn, his master's degree from Oxford, and his doctorate from UCLA. His studies over the years have included extensive research and concentrated on the consequences of terrorism, the motives of terrorism, and the implications for counterterrorism strategies. While he has been associated with other universities in a variety of capacities over the years, both here and abroad, he's currently an assistant professor of political science here at Northeastern University. He's a frequent terrorist analyst on the media, over a wide variety of media, including Al Jazeera, the BBC, PBS, CNN, Fox News, and the Los Angeles Times, among others. He's an active term member on the Council of Foreign Relations, the Human Security Center in London, and the Center for Terrorism Studies in Rome. His work has been published in many highly regarded peer-reviewed journals, as well as appearing in many edited volumes. So, as a result, it's a pleasure to have him with us today, and we'll give him a warm Northeastern at Noon welcome.
Lovely and long introduction for coming out in this monsoon weather. So basically, we could do two different things. We could talk about what's going on in the world today. There's a lot of stuff going on in the world, especially as it relates to terrorism. Or we could talk about my terrorism research. And what I've been told to do, to be honest, I prefer doing a Q&A and talking with new audiences about what's going on around the world because I already know my research, but I will, I guess, zip through some of the work that I do with an eye towards opening it up to Q&A. My presentation, you know how research is, it's kind of narrow. Your questions don't feel like you need to ask about the research that I've presented. We can really talk about any aspect about terrorism and the geopolitical situation. There's a lot of stuff going on, especially today or this week with the UN General Assembly and Putin coming here and now Putin invading Syria and very fluid interesting and frankly dangerous situation. So kicking off the research here, the story really begins about a decade ago. And I headed to the West Bank to do some field research. And this was a very interesting time in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for two main reasons, although that conflict is always interesting. The first is that this was the time of what's sometimes called the Second Intifada, which was basically the height of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in terms of the number of fatalities. And secondly, Israel was in the process of doing something new. Rather than sitting down with the Palestinians as it did during the Oslo peace process, Israel was in the process of erecting a massive security wall or a security fence, whatever you want to call it, effectively separating the Palestinian-dominated West Bank from the rest of Israel. And so I went out to the West Bank really hoping to try to understand more about the conflict, try to understand the Israeli view, the Palestinian view, especially because the next year I was set to begin a PhD in political science at UCLA, and I thought that maybe going out there would, spur some ideas for my dissertation. So the Israelis I spoke to, what they told me is that they actually really didn't like the wall that they were creating, that they were not at all proud of this, that it was ugly, expensive, and sort of a realization that something rather serious had failed, that the Israelis couldn't amicably resolve their differences with the Palestinians. They couldn't sit down at the negotiating table. According to the Israelis, they wanted to. Support for the Oslo peace process had over majority support when it started among Israelis in 1993. But what the Israelis stressed is that over time, with each Palestinian terrorist attack, support for the peace process declined. And it declined so much to the point that the Palestinians, from the Israeli perspective, were no longer viewed as a viable partner for peace. And so for Israelis' own security, they had to physically prevent Palestinians from crossing into pre-1967 Israeli borders, thus the wall. The Palestinians I spoke to, of course, had a very different perspective on the wall, understandably. Their emphasis was how horrible the wall is for them in all sorts of ways. It's embarrassing to them. It hurts their economy. And it frankly takes up a lot of time. Like a Palestinian might want to visit a family member, but they'll have to go on this very circuitous route to make that happen. I experienced that with them. And furthermore, there's a sense among the Palestinians that this wall was basically permanently negatively affecting the future borders of a Palestinian state. That as a result of this wall, any future Palestinian state would now be smaller. And so I spent a lot of my time basically talking to Israelis and Palestinians. I got the Israeli side because I was living in Jerusalem. I would take a cabin with Israelis, drive around, then I would get out in the West Bank, and I had a translator from ABC News. And in that manner, I conversed with the Palestinians. And so I mentioned that I was trying to think, how could I write a dissertation about this? What does the academic literature have to say about all of this? And so I had this habit of printing out academic articles on terrorism, which I would read from the back of the cab during these excursions throughout the West Bank. And what I came across was a now very famous article by a guy named Robert Pape, Professor Robert Pape at the University of Chicago. He had published right around this time an article in the flagship journal in political science called The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism. And this is now the most widely cited study on terrorism that's ever been written. Thousands and thousands of citations. And you can understand why it's such a famous study, because in a way, it's very, very ambitious. It purports to explain why people engage in terrorism. And at the same time, it's also extraordinarily simple. And so the argument really, really resonates. And his basic argument, which I call the strategic model, is that terrorism is rational political behavior. That groups turn to terrorism, specifically, they blow up civilian targets because it's the most effective tactic available to them to achieve their political demands. The causal logic, the strategic logic is very intuitive. Basically, a bunch of aggrieved people bomb civilians or shoot civilians, and that puts pressure on governments to relent politically in order to try to appease the perpetrators, in order to, stave off the possibility of future terrorist attacks. And that in exchange, the perpetrators basically end up profiting politically. And so, what Pape emphasized is that, sure, lower level members, they might be crazy, they might just be totally, irrational and angry or something, who knows what, but that the leadership of these groups is actually very calculating and smart and strategic. And that's why the leaders command their foot soldiers to engage in terrorism by attacking civilian targets. Now, this was a very interesting theory, but empirically, he didn't offer much support. That is to say, he largely asserted this theory without providing evidence for its factual basis. What Pape points to, as far as facts go, is the case of the Palestinians, which he described as, quote, the paradigmatic example that terrorism pays. According to Robert Pape, again, terrorism is strategic behavior. The leaders command foot soldiers to attack civilian targets because it's so effective at softening the target country up to make concessions to the perpetrators. And as proof, he points to the Palestinians. So I was immediately struck by the disconnect between what this very prominent scholar was saying about why groups turn to terrorism and the reality on the ground. I did not meet a single Palestinian who thought that their terrorism was paying politically. The Palestinians understood that this wall was being created in response to their terrorism and that it affected them in all sorts of ways, both personal as well as political. Indeed, support for the peace process was much higher before there was any terrorism. The Israelis are actually right that with each terrorist attack, public support within Israel for negotiating with the Palestinians declined. And that's, after all, why they ended up creating this wall. And so I began to think to myself, wow, this is really interesting. If the Palestinians are the political success story, then how have other groups fared that also use terrorism? And so in grad school, I set out to look at this question of what is the political outcome of terrorism? Do countries tend to make concessions to the terrorists? Is this a helpful strategy for the perpetrators? If not, what's a superior strategy for aggrieved groups to win over political demands? And so I began basically in the most elementary fashion, methodologically, moving into more and more sophisticated methodological approaches as I was forced to take, statistics and other classes in grad school. So I began with a case study on the Palestinians, which I won't really get into, where, again, it was a more detailed case study, and I do not find support that terrorism is politically effective in the way that the strategic model would suggest. I then looked at Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, what were Al-Qaeda's goals? Well, bin Laden said that there were 4 main goals to 9/11. For the US to sever relations with what bin Laden called apostate regimes, which are essentially Muslim governments or Muslim countries ruled by governments that are too pro-Western for his liking. Situations where the Arab street is probably less pro-Israel than the leadership, like the Mubarak government in Egypt or the House of Saud. So bin Laden wanted to sever relations between the US and these pro-Western Muslim regimes. According to bin Laden, the purpose of 9/11 was also to sever US-Israeli relations. It was to expel the United States from the Persian Gulf. And it was to halt Muslim killing around the world in what bin Laden called Crusader Wars. So how did the United States respond to 9/11? Well, of course, we actually did the political opposite. We strengthened our relations with these so-called apostate regimes. The idea of empowering the proverbial Arab street seemed like a lot less attractive than relying on, time-tested strongmen who didn't favor democracy. U.S.-Israeli relations were not severed. In fact, they improved. This was the heyday of the U.S.-Israeli special relationship. You may recall that Bush and Sharon were on very close terms. The U.S. was not expelled from the Persian Gulf. Quite the contrary. 9/11 became the key rationale for us to occupy Iraq. Not only did we not withdraw from the Persian Gulf, we increased our troop presence by a factor of 15. And of course, 9/11 did not induce the United States to stop killing Muslims around the world. Unfortunately, we've killed many Muslims in collateral damage, not intentionally, in the context of the war on terrorism. I see similarities with our response to Islamic State, to the international community's response to Islamic State. Now, it's very common for pundits in the media to describe Islamic State as this uncontrollable juggernaut that's so successful for which we really don't have any answers. And yet, actually, when you look closely at what actually happens when Islamic State has attacked all sorts of different countries in the world, it's not entirely clear that Islamic State, at least in the long term, is going to benefit from this kind of violent behavior. So take the United States, for example. The United States really showed very little interest in militarily responding to Islamic State until what happened? Until Islamic State beheaded our journalist, James Foley. Immediately after that, Obama made a speech about how Islamic State can't stand, how we were going to expand the military campaign from Iraq into Syria. We were going to build up a big international coalition because we can't have this group chopping off Americans' heads. Look at how France responded to its terrorist attacks with Charlie Hebdo. The French were not intimidated by these attacks. The French actually became more defiant. They didn't say, let's sit down and negotiate with Islamic State, see what we could do for them politically to try to pay them off. Instead, the French said, you know what? Why don't you take our one Navy carrier, aircraft carrier, and put it move it to the Persian Gulf so that you can have flights and really bomb the hell out of Islamic State. And France, of course, increased its own participation in the campaign. The French public did not turn to the left and become more conciliatory to Islamic State. The French public actually moved to the right. The Front National gained a lot of popular support. And Charlie Hebdo sales, it's not even as if the French said, you know what, it's dangerous, this Charlie Hebdo. Charlie Hebdo's sales went from the thousands into like the millions. And the French turned out, you'll recall that there were terrorists that were believed to be on the loose. The Kouachi brothers were still not found. The French had a march called the French March. More French people turned up for that march than since World War II. So the French were very defiant. The same, I can go through every single country that's been attacked by Islamic State, and what you'll see is that they don't become more conciliatory, they become more hawkish. The Jordanians, for example, it was before the Jordan was actually attacked. Jordan was a very weak supporter in the coalition against Islamic State. The Jordanian public basically believed that Islamic State was a Western creation that was dangerous really to the West, but that it really didn't jeopardize the Jordanian people. And then one of Jordan's pilots went down over Islamic State territory and they torched him. And all of a sudden, the Jordanian public couldn't line up fast enough behind the Hashemite kingdom, and they, for the first time, really started bombing Islamic State. The same thing happened with Egypt. Egypt wasn't really a participant against Islamic State, and then Islamic State thought that it would chop off 21 Egyptian Coptics' heads in Libya. And all of a sudden, Egypt said, you know what, we have a huge population here, we're really pissed off, we would be happy to take the lead in basically forming some pan-Arab military force to take on Islamic State. Even Japan, according to Article 9 of the Constitution, is banned from making war. This was a condition of their surrender after World War II. And then Islamic State thought it would be a good idea to kill 2 of its citizens, and now the Japanese public is pushing to overturn Article 9 and to develop some kind of a war-making capability to respond to threats like Islamic State. Now, these are all just anecdotal examples, essentially. And you should be worried when a speaker comes up and tells you that they have answers about terrorism and then presents to you anecdotal examples. And the reason why is because there have been so many terrorist attacks around the world that go back so long, that span geographically all over the globe. And so it's very easy to be sold by selecting anecdotal examples because there is seemingly an example about terrorism for every theory that any scholar might try to peddle. And so what I always do is I make sure that my research is a large N study. That is to say, a study with many, many observations, generally a statistical study. So that way I can test whether what I am saying essentially travels beyond a certain, anecdotal example, which might be salient, but isn't necessarily representative of how terrorism actually works. And so in grad school as a PhD student, I published the first large N studies with many, many cases on the political effectiveness of terrorism. And what I thought to do was to basically separate groups that mainly blow up civilian targets, which is generally the way people understand terrorism, is against the population. There's no consensus over that, and I'm happy to talk about various definitions about terrorism, who uses what definition and when and why. But in general, it is fair to say that most American political scientists certainly understand terrorism as when non-state actors, either an individual, a lone wolf, or a small cell, or a larger organization, harms a civilian target for some kind of political goal. So I took those and I put them in one category. Basically, groups that direct their violence against civilians. Then I took, out of a sample, the groups that mainly direct their attacks against military targets, not civilian targets. And what I found is that the groups that mainly direct their violence against civilian targets had a much, much worse political success rate. That is to say that, that countries that have their civilians attacked are much less likely to grant the perpetrators their demands than when countries have their military targets attacked, right? So like just to, so we're on the same page here, an example of a civilian attack would be, well, blowing this room up, or blowing up a movie theater, or blowing up a Sparrows, or blowing up a school, right? An example of a military attack would be, taking the treads off of a tank or something. And I thought to do this because when I analyzed a lot what bin Laden had to say, I was particularly interested in which military campaigns he personally deemed as successes, and which campaigns sort of mobilized him to commit 9/11 and to think that it might do some political good. And what I noticed is that bin Laden, was a very loquacious guy. He talked a ton, and he repeatedly emphasized 3 campaigns, which according to him, he thought were, wonderful successes. And this is when Hezbollah, the Lebanese, Iranian-supported terrorist group, attacked the American peacekeepers in 1983, which forced them to withdraw from Lebanon. When Hezbollah attacked the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, forcing them to withdraw. When the Mujahideen attacked the Red Army, the Soviets in Afghanistan. And also when American, I think it was Marines, were attacked in that famous Black Hawk Down episode in Somalia, which basically quickly led us to withdraw. In all of these cases, it is true that withdrawals were made. Hezbollah forced the Israelis to withdraw. Hezbollah forced the Americans and the French to withdraw, right? So that's the Hezbollah case. The Mujahideen forced the Soviets to withdraw from Afghanistan. And Black Hawk Down forced the Americans out of Somalia. And I started thinking, you know what? Is that really terrorism, though? Who are these targets? These are actually military targets, That chopper that was shot down, that wasn't civilians. The Red Army occupying Afghanistan, that's not really civilian targets. It's not as if the Mujahideen were blowing up movie theaters in Moscow. And so I started thinking to myself, you know what? Maybe if we disaggregate this kind of militant violence, and we separate it by attacks against civilian targets versus military targets, that can explain to a large extent how governments respond to this kind of violence. And so I basically, in dividing up the groups that mainly attack civilians and the groups that mainly attack military, I was able to establish that contrary to the strategic model, there's actually a very strong correlation between groups that engage in terrorism, i.e. by attacking civilian targets, and those that come up empty in terms of inducing governments into making concessions. And on that point, I do believe that the field has generally accepted this empirical finding. However, there's actually been a lot of pushback. Because my claim is that terrorism, defined as civilian targeting, is actually a very, very poor strategy or tactic, whatever you want to call it. And that it's actually inherent to the tactic itself. My argument is that all else equal, aggrieved groups, if they want to induce concessions, would actually be wise not to attack civilian targets. And what my critics said was, you know what? It may be true that groups that engage in terrorism seldom achieve their political goals, but maybe it has nothing to do with their tactical choice of terrorism per se. You know, terrorism is sometimes described as a so-called weapon of the weak. The idea is that groups turn to terrorism because they're too weak to adopt other kinds of tactics. And so my critics said, you know what? It's really not surprising that perpetrators of terrorism have such a low political success rate because they only use terrorism when other tactics, have failed. Or other people said to me, well, it's not surprising that terrorists would so infrequently achieve their political demands because terrorists, by dint of their extreme tactics, are such extremists. They have such extreme political goals. It doesn't really matter, how a non-state actor, what kind of tactics they use. If they say, we want to establish a caliphate, no government is going to say, you know what, that's a great idea. It has nothing to do with their tactical choice. And so what I've done statistically is I've basically managed to isolate the independent impact of using all sorts of different kinds of tactics after controlling for or taking into account all sorts of other factors that might be essentially doing the work. So for example, in my studies, I take out statistically the capability of the group. And what I find is that all else equal, when you control for the capability of the group, attacking civilian targets still lowers the chances of government concessions. I factor in the nature of the group's political demands. I control for how extreme they are. Do they have moderate demands? Are they asking for $10? Do they have extreme demands? Are they asking for a communist revolution or a caliphate? I take into account all these things. I isolate the independent impact of their tactical choices. And what I find is that across samples, going back decades, including hundreds of groups from all over the world, groups are much more politically effective when they eschew terrorism, when they do not attack civilian targets, in particular when they use violence, not indiscriminately blowing up anything willy-nilly, but when they use violence more selectively against military targets. That has a much more positive effect in terms of increasing the odds of government concessions, even after we take into account all sorts of potential confounds like group capability, the nature of their demands, etc. And so my research now no longer focuses on this question of whether terrorism works or not. I've really beaten that to death. But it has led to a very interesting research question, which I do focus on now. And basically, my research now focuses on what I call the puzzle of terrorism. And the puzzle is, why do groups attack civilian targets if it doesn't seem to pay politically? And so, let's see how much time we have. So this is taking up some time. I'm going to really cruise through this theory in order for us to get to a Q&A and just talk about terrorism more generally. But basically, I've developed a model, a organizational model that can predict whether groups attack civilian targets and when and why. And the model has absolutely nothing to do with whether terrorism pays politically. Basically, the strategic model, just to remind you from the beginning, said that groups turn to terrorism because the leadership is very smart and they're rational and they're strategic, and that's why they direct their foot soldiers to attack civilian targets. Well, if it turns out that terrorism is actually politically counterproductive behavior, then maybe, it occurred to me, the strategic model has things in reverse. Maybe groups turn to terrorism not when they're directed by the leadership to attack civilian targets, but when the group is led by a weak leader. Maybe groups led by weaker leaders are more inclined to engage in politically suboptimal tactics by attacking civilian targets. And I think that this makes a lot of sense because basically, I think that there's an inverse relationship between one's position within the organizational hierarchy of the group and one's incentives for harming civilians. That is to say, I believe that lower level members of the organization have stronger incentives for blowing up civilians than people at the top. And so, therefore, groups led by weaker leaders, groups in which the leadership is forced to delegate more tactical autonomy to lower level members, these are the groups I hypothesized would be more inclined to engage in terrorism by attacking civilian targets. And I think that for all sorts of reasons, there's this inverse relationship between one's position in the organizational hierarchy and one's incentives for harming civilians. For example, take gangs. In gangs, you may have heard that low-level people, in order to be, accepted into the gang, they have to often do something very fanatical. They often have to kill somebody to be accepted into the gang, and by basically demonstrating their fanatical bona fides, to demonstrate to the leadership that they really are committed to the group, right? Whereas if you're at the top, you don't need to engage in this sort of career outbidding. This really only applies to lower level members. An example that's sort of contemporary is Jihadi John, for example. Jihadi John traveled to Syria and became basically Islamic State's beheader-in-chief. He acted as savage as they come, and as a consequence, he rose up within the ranks in Islamic State and basically became in charge of all of the foreign jihadis there. And so this kind of gruesome violence against civilian targets, it might not induce governments into making concessions, but it can help members' careers within the organization, especially for those at the low level. Furthermore, I figure that that the leadership tends to be older, that they tend to have the most experience in asymmetric conflict. Indeed, many leaders of terrorist groups were also their founders. And so I would think that, if terrorism, defined as civilian targeting, doesn't really have the desired political effect, that the older people would be more likely to realize that this is not a useful tactic, whereas low-level members like suicide attackers, they generally are younger, and they have little experience participating in a terrorist group. They're fresh off the streets. They don't have a good sense of how governments might respond differently depending on the target selection. But there are many different reasons why I believe that basically lower level members are more inclined than the leadership to want to attack civilian targets. And so I basically tested out this organizational theory in all sorts of really cool ways. For example, I looked at the structure of militant groups. Specifically, are they highly centralized around a leader, or are they very decentralized and diffuse? And what I found is that all else equal, it's these decentralized groups which are more likely to attack civilian targets, and that makes sense because in any sort of decentralized system, the rank and file has more autonomy than when the system or the organization is more centralized under the direction of the leadership. I also predicted that as operatives travel further and further away from the leadership, they would basically gain a measure of autonomy because communications would become harder from the leader to the foot soldier. And so I predicted that as foot soldiers move further away from the leadership in the form of international attacks, that these kinds of attacks would also be more likely to be directed against civilian targets. I've also studied in depth data on drone campaigns. And what I predicted is that when a drone successfully takes out the leader of a militant group, that militant group is much more likely to redirect its violence from military to civilian targets because all of a sudden, lower level members of the organization are calling the shots. I even find that when we rain down a whole lot of drones on the leaders, even when they don't actually connect with the leader and it scares them and they go into hiding, that this also increases the tactical autonomy of the rank and file, which changes their target selection. It makes them much more likely to attack civilian targets than military targets. And I find that over time, as a leader emerges to replace the decapitated one, again, the pattern of violence goes back. That it becomes more likely to attack military targets than civilian targets as a leader reemerges through this group. So basically, I would just conclude there, I think, as far as the research portion goes. But I do have this, I think that there are a number of policy-relevant findings to what I've presented. I can basically predict whether governments will end up negotiating with the perpetrators or not. I can predict which groups will blow up civilians, which won't, and why. You can imagine how this might be useful. For example, TSA, for example, you go to the airport. This is a civilian target. I would submit that we don't actually need to be on the lookout for every possible group. Many groups do not actually attack civilian targets, but I can tell you which ones do and which ones we should focus on. There are also some counterintuitive implications about Islamic State. Again, people like to describe Islamic State as this unstoppable juggernaut, we just can't respond to this group, but I would predict that Islamic State actually is going to burn out. It's not going to happen all at once, clearly, but I do believe that more moderate groups, and by the way, I'm not saying these are moderate groups, but they are simply more moderate groups in terms of the avoidance of killing civilians, that it's actually those groups which will outperform Islamic State in the long term. Because, when you attack civilian targets, it really upsets the local population. And the local population is less interested in joining your group if if the group is killing their relatives. And other rebel groups also don't want to participate with a group like that if it's seen as being completely unhinged and immoral. And furthermore, target countries, their governments are much more inclined to direct their violence against, the most extreme groups, while sort of giving the more moderate groups a pass. And already we're seeing signs of this. For example, in Syria, there's a lot of talk, understandably, about Islamic State's growth there, but I would encourage you not to take your eyes off of Al-Qaeda there. Al-Qaeda in Syria is called Nusra, and the reason why is because Nusra is a whole lot like Islamic State, but it's just not quite as radical. It doesn't blow up civilians in the same sort of way, and so consequently, the international community is not as intent on harming Al-Qaeda, whereas Islamic State really doesn't have any state backers. Al-Qaeda in Syria does. The Gulf countries, the Sunni Gulf countries, do support Islamic State financially, countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And already Nusra is getting along much, much better with the other rebel groups in Syria. So there are all sorts of different rebel groups of varying levels of extremeness. Islamic State's the most extreme. Nusra is a little bit less extreme. Then there's like Al-Sham, which is less extreme. There's the Free Syrian Army, which is less extreme. All of these groups, the Free Syrian Army, Al-Sham, they have no problem working with Islamic State, or with Al-Qaeda, with Nusra. because they're more moderate. They have much less of an interest in working with Islamic State. And so consequently, the narrative that we're hearing of Islamic State essentially being unstoppable is counter to my own predictions, and I think that it's inconsistent with what's actually happening, at least in Syria. There are also some interesting implications about social media. You may have seen stories about how Islamic State, say, uses Twitter or Facebook to propagate these very violent videos like of Jihadi John chopping off people's heads. And the conventional wisdom on that is that this is a very, very effective recruitment strategy. And that groups are acting rationally by using these tactics, by harming people in such a savage fashion and then disseminating it all over the world. I actually think that this kind of violence is itself, over the long term, counterproductive, never mind when groups broadcast it so publicly. And so I'm not actually in favor of what some people have called an ISIS social media blackout. I do not think that we should prevent Islamic State from propagating these videos of its misdeeds, because it's exactly these kinds of actions which ultimately is turning the international community against this group. Thanks so much. So, yeah. Honestly, not really. I mean, that's just short. I mean, I think that many people in the world do view Russian involvement as a invasion. After all, Russia is Russia, Syria is Syria. Just this week, Russia created an airfield close to Damascus and actually kicked out the Syrian military there and said, if we find any of you guys, we're personally going to escort you out. So in that sense, it might be understood as an invasion. On the other hand, the elected leader, Assad, has invited the Russians into Syria. So the Russians are there at the request of the Syrian government. I think the question comes down to, do you regard the Syrian government as legitimate? If you do, it's not an invasion. If you don't, it probably is. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yes, please. That's a really good question. Well, I would have to say no, but I do sort of proxy that indirectly. For example, I do look at attributes of not just the perpetrators, but attributes of the target country. In particular, probably the most relevant one for your question would be, I look at the regime type of the country. That is to say, is it an authoritarian country? Is it a democratic country? And this is relevant because it's widely believed that democracies are more blood shy, that they're much less interested in fighting terrorists because, by definition, we care about the individual. And so therefore, democracies are believed to be more subject to political blackmail and basically worse fighters, not just because we're sensitive to our own losses, but because there are normative restrictions on how strong we can respond, because we don't want to harm other civilians in the process, right? So regime type, in a way, proxies how free the country is to respond forcefully. So I do control for regime type. An anecdotal example of how democracies may respond differently to non-democracies. You take how Putin responded to the Chechens. He turned Grozny into a parking lot. That's a very harsh response that a democratic country would certainly think twice about doing. So in that way, regime type proxies the resolve or the motivation, the capability of the target country. I also take into account other properties of the target country, not just the regime type. For example, the population size, its GDP, how big its economy is, there's a variable for how technologically sophisticated the target country is. So I rule those things out. Yeah. Sure. So since 2008, the drone campaign has been the cornerstone of U.S. counterterrorism strategy. And there's all sorts of appealing reasons for why this is the case. To a large extent, it's a response to the fact that our boots on the ground, that didn't work out very well, particularly in Iraq. And furthermore, there have been technological developments which have improved the drone, right? And furthermore, the international terrorism threat has become more diffuse geographically. It would be impossible to deploy troops in all of these places, Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, just not feasible. And so the drone seemed like a really good answer. And in response, some academics began studying basically the effectiveness of the drone campaign. And there's really no consensus over whether drones work or not. It really depends on how scholars have operationalized the study. My own views on the efficacy of the drone campaign have changed. The most methodologically rigorous studies seem to find that drones actually do work, right? But, I pay very close attention to what's going on in the world, and that just didn't jive with what I was actually seeing. An example would be, Baghdadi, the leader of Islamic State. In March 18th, we launched a strike against him. We thought that it succeeded. It turned out that it didn't. In another case, in the case of the Taliban, we thought Mullah Omar was the leader. It turned out that he had been dead for 2 years. So, if we're not even sure whether the leader is dead or alive, that hardly attests to the efficacy of taking out the leadership, My research is different. I didn't directly get into this question of whether drones work or not. What I was interested in seeing is how removing the leader of a militant group affects the type of violence that it wages. How does it change their tactical choices? And in line with my theory, I find that when the leader has been taken out, the group becomes much more sort of indiscriminate in its targeting, much more likely to attack civilian targets for the reason that I theorized. Yeah.
I noticed that you did mention the terrorist attack on Spain. And it seems to me that was terrifically successful from the standpoint of their goals.
Yes, that's a very good point. So what basically happened is in 2004, there was an attack on the Madrid train station. 191 people were killed. And what happened after that was, you might know the history better than I do. I'm not a Spain expert, but the leader, the prime minister, Aznar, who was right-wing and who was basically in favor of a hawkish kind of counterterrorism response. Spain had troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. Aznar was basically tight with the Bush administration. And after this attack, Aznar lost the election. Zapatero, the left-leaning challenger to the incumbent, won. And so immediately upon winning, he basically fulfilled his campaign pledge to bring the Spanish troops home out of Iraq. And so when I present this kind of research sometimes for my well-read audience members, they will say to me, well, it is not always true. It's not always true that terrorism doesn't pay politically. There is at least one very important salient example where in response to an attack against a civilian target, the government did make concessions. That is true. My theory is probabilistic. It's not deterministic. It doesn't account for every single case. But in general, I'm basically describing a pattern. The same is true about almost any scientific finding, like smoking, for example. My grandmother smoked 2 packs of cigarettes, and she lived into like her late 90s, but you wouldn't conclude then that terrorism promotes longevity, even though there are certain cases where smokers do live beyond the normal. There are also other reasons to think that maybe that case is a little bit iffy. For example, before the attack, the difference in polling between Zapatero and Aznar fell within the margin of error. So it's not as if Zapatero all of a sudden gained all this support and was able to unseat Aznar in that fashion. They were basically in a statistical tie. And what I've read is that in general, over time, as the election, as the polls get closer to the election, the left historically has turned out in greater numbers than the right. So I'm not even sure how strong of a counterexample that is, but I do agree with you that it's an important one, and it gives me a good opportunity to explain that basically I'm speaking in generalities, and there are absolutely counter cases.
You were speaking earlier in your talk about the underlings in any group trying to rise up by doing terrorism action.
Yeah.
And that the leaders may not even know that that was going to happen. But if in fact the leaders reward that by letting them move up, wouldn't that be part built on the leaders' part? Certainly if they forbid it and punish the underlings,
Yeah.
there would be less of it.
That's a really good question. So how do leaders respond to when underlings engage in civilian targeting? They have a range of different responses. In some cases, the lower level members, when they're found out or when they're egregious enough to reach the leadership, they could get in some trouble. For example, the Taliban kills a lot of civilians, almost as many as any other terrorist group over, I would say actually, over the past 5 years, probably the number one group for killing civilians. So you might be left with the impression that the leadership says, go out and kill civilians, but that's not what the leadership was saying. Mullah Omar in particular used to stress, do not attack the population. This actually only taints our image among the population. And sometimes, on rare occasions, egregious violators would be punished under Sharia law. In other cases, the leadership doesn't do anything at all, or may even reward them. What I have looked at is, what is the likelihood that lower level members will engage in this kind of violence, depending on the leader's basically public position on it. And what I find is that when the leader is opposed, at least rhetorically, to civilian targeting, lower level members are less likely to do it. And what makes them even less likely to do it is when the leader is strong. So when the leader of a group is strong and opposes civilian targeting, the odds that the lower level members engage in civilian targeting are very small. Yes?
From the last century, Hitler thought he would bring England to its knees by destroying the civilian people in London. Didn't work. And of course, on the other hand, Japan thought they
Right. Yeah, I mean, so, I touched on this, that there's really no consensus over the definition of terrorism. In North America, we tend to define it as non-state actors. We're talking about, again, the lone wolf, the small cell, or the larger terrorist organization. In other areas of the world, they have a broader definition of terrorism. For example, in the Middle East, when they think of terrorism, they often think of states, right? They think of governments doing the terrorizing. I had a friend who wanted to do field research in the Middle East, and he said, I'd like to come and research terrorism, and not just the state variety, just to give you a sense of how widespread that view is. So, I mean, what you're talking about is really the government use of violence, whether it's against civilians or not. I don't actually directly test that. However, other scholars have, and that is actually not called terrorism studies. For whatever reason, that falls under the rubric of what might be called civilian victimization, the CV literature. And what they have found is that in general, governments are more successful politically when they do not attack civilian targets, when they direct their violence against military targets. And this makes me feel a little bit more confident in my research, because what that suggests is that my results aren't driven by the nature of the perpetrator so much as the tactic itself against civilian targets, which seems to be counterproductive, whether perpetrated by a non-state actor or a state.
I have a quick question, and that is, recently the Iranians have blamed the House of Saudi for the death of 700 pilgrims,
Yeah.
which I suppose might be construed as a backhanded way of civilian terrorism, not looking out for their safety properly.
Yeah.
How vulnerable is the House of Saudi to attacks?
Oh, well, first of all, I think that there's a big sectarian war going on in Iran, and the Iranians and the Saudis, they'll take any chance to blame anything on the other. I think that in terms of the safety of the Hajj, my understanding is that the kingdom has invested billions of dollars recently to try to make it safer. And it's really, on the other hand, when I actually read about the sorts of activities that the pilgrims, or whatever you want to call it, were engaged in, they did sound rather dangerous to me. At one point, they were, throwing stones at things. So maybe the kingdom should have had a greater role in trying to ensure their safety. I think that the Saudis and the other Sunni Gulf countries in general haven't been very smart in terms of counterterrorism. Basically, these Sunni countries, the one thing that they really, really, really hate is not the radical Sunni terrorist groups like Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, but it's Iran. And there's no stronger manifestation of that than the Assad regime, right? And so these Sunni Gulf countries, to the extent that they're motivated by anything at all, it's basically has been to pump money into these Sunni groups in order to topple the Assad regime. And the consequence has been that now these Sunni groups have gotten very, very strong, particularly Islamic State. And that is going to come back and bite the hand that was feeding these groups. These groups are not really allies of the kingdom. The kingdom is much more moderate. And so I think that these Sunni countries will become useful in the anti-ISIS coalition increasingly as they realize that these very groups threaten them.
On the stone throwing, there was a section
I don't really know much about that.
where they throw the stone
Yeah,
at the wall
yeah,
at the double.
yeah. I think that's what I was reading about in terms of where the stampede and when the stampede happened. I don't know if it's causal, but it does seem like maybe that's not the safest activity to engage in. Maybe there'll be more oversight next year.
We have time for one more question. Anyone? All right then.
All righty.
Well.
Thank you so much.